Spoilers for Breaking Bad. Content note. This video talks in depth about race and racism, white supremacy, sexism, and disability, as well as mentions addiction and drugs, particularly meth. A mention of sexual assault in the series occurs at this timestamp. The timestamp to avoid is also in the description below. Please proceed with caution. When I was in high school and Breaking Bad was on the air, I wasn't watching it. But I was aware that I was living through the second era of what some may call the golden age of television. This golden age started most notably with The Sopranos and continued up until the early 2010s with the ending of Breaking Bad, Mad Men, and Game of Thrones. In short, the golden age of television was defined by high-budget TV dramas shown on prestige networks. And honestly, many of the shows, but not all, mainly catered to middle-aged and older white men. Go figure. And as someone who is well-versed and enjoys shows made for middle-aged and aging white men, like Pawn Stars, Westworld, Vikings, Mad Men, etc., I actually sat down to watch Breaking Bad this past month somewhat skeptically. Like, blow me away, you harbinger of the golden age of TV. I think I was also just kind of put off by this premise because it seemed like a suburban gothic story we've seen all too many times before. Middle-aged white guy in a midlife crisis facing down death decides he has nothing to lose, retakes control of his life by doing something dangerous, thus fulfilling his massive ego by manipulating the people around him, and then that ego is the thing that brings him down and tears his life apart. There wasn't any historical angle that would usually bring me in, nor a sci-fi or fantasy setting to make the world more interesting. It was just going to be blunt realism, and I wasn't sure how enthralling that would be for 5 seasons. But I binged the entire show, I know, not the way it was meant to be watched, and now Breaking Bad is one of my favorite shows. And this is what this video is going to be about, why I really enjoyed the show, the characters, and its themes. I also am going to more closely analyze how those themes are portrayed, and if the show does a good job at getting them across to the audience. I also just am really curious to hear other people's takes on the show almost a decade later, so let me know what you think down below. So grab a drink and get comfy because this is going to be a long one. So before we get into the plot, characters, and thematic analysis, I want to talk about why I think Breaking Bad is such a successful show, and a good one at that, and that is because of its unbothered writing. As any viewer could tell you, and as I will tell you now, the writing of Breaking Bad is incredibly tight. There are no loose ends, everything that you think is going to come back comes back, and everything you want to happen and know is going to happen, happens. It's so satisfying, I can't even really begin to explain it, you just have to witness it. In a current media landscape that is so obsessed with outsmarting its audience, it's nice to finally just sit back and watch a show that ends the way it says it's going to end. No twists, no surprises. For example, I was watching Red Notice on Netflix before Breaking Bad and came to the conclusion that it was a bad movie. I do not recommend watching it, but I only felt that way after the dreaded twist ending was revealed. For some years now, it seems that TV shows and movies can't just progress in a logical fashion, but rather need a twist in order to shock the viewers and to create buzz. This can be seen with the twist villain ending in Zootopia, when President Coin turns out to be just as bad as President Snow, and when Daenerys was evil all along. Really? There seems to be a trend where writers in Hollywood are working harder to one-up and outsmart their audience, rather than give them a satisfying story. Some have attributed this to the rise of CinemaSins, which was just starting to gain popularity when Breaking Bad was ending. For those of you who aren't in the know, CinemaSins is a type of nitpicky criticism where you review a piece of work with the sole purpose of pointing out all of its flaws, without remembering it's a movie, in order to make yourself look smarter than the text. So in order to combat this, writers have tried to CinemaSins-proof their films and series to protect them from this type of, let's call it what it is, lazy and smug criticism. In addition, writers are so worried about audiences figuring out where their stories are going that some have asked fans to stop guessing because it'll ruin the story if people can predict the next logical step in a series. Rather than that being seen as good writing, it's seen as a nuisance. Writers and critics at this day and age are at odds due to this new hostile environment where there can only be one winner. Westworld writer Jonathan Nolan actually asked viewers to stop trying to figure out what comes next, saying, "It's annoying sometimes when people guess the twist and then blog about it, but the engagement is gratifying on one level because if someone guesses your twist, it means you've done an adequate job. You can't complain when people are that engaged. It's very gratifying, but stop doing it, please." Though some people on Reddit speculated that Nolan was just joking, that's a pretty lame thing to joke about. Throwing in an extra unexpected twist doesn't only create a frustrating viewing experience, it's only mind-blowing after one watch, and then the piece of media tends to lose all of its weight and meaning. When the twist is revealed and when they rewind to all of the things that you supposedly missed to make you feel like a fool, it just comes off as mean-spirited. Satisfying stories are satisfying and rewatchable when they fulfill your expectations, and even more so when they exceed your expectations by having good payoffs, tight writing, and execution. Usually films and series with surprise and twist endings take the lazy way out because they don't want to put in the time and effort it takes into crafting a well laid out work. But this isn't the case with Breaking Bad, who was able to escape this type of nitpicky criticism, having ended in 2013. This is all to say that I really missed this pre-CinemaSins era of TV, where writers didn't feel the need to respond to miscellaneous and unimportant plot holes, and rather just focused on giving audiences well-rounded stories. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of Breaking Bad and analyze its themes, let me briefly introduce the plot and characters. Breaking Bad centers around the White family. Our patriarch, Walter, is a high school chemistry teacher, but it's alluded to that he was on track to become a successful millionaire with his former Caltech colleagues until something got in the way. He's not particularly happy with his life, even though his wife, Skyler, and son Walter Jr., who likes to be called Flynn, love him. We learn that Skyler and Walt met when she was working as a hostess near a restaurant at his old laboratory job. Additionally, we learn that Walt only saw their current house as a starter home, only to still be living there 16 years later. Their teenage son Flynn is disabled and has cerebral palsy, and is actually portrayed by an actor who is disabled and who has cerebral palsy named R.J. Mitty. While Walt and Flynn go to school together, Skyler keeps the house running, and she's also expecting a second child. She has a sister named Marie, a radiologist, who also has kleptomania, but she's seeing a therapist in order to cope. Marie's husband, Hank, is a DEA agent, DEA standing for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Everything is going fine until it's discovered that on Walt's 50th birthday, he's diagnosed with stage 3A lung cancer, which he keeps from his family as long as he can. In the meantime, knowing that he doesn't have enough money for treatment and not wanting to accept charity handouts from his former colleagues, he decides his best option is to start cooking meth, roping in Jesse, his former failure of a student. Throughout the series, Walt's wants and needs come into conflict. What Walt wants is to leave a nest egg for his family after he eventually dies of cancer, but what he needs is to finally realize that he didn't do all of this for his family, but for his unyielding ego, and in the end he comes to this realization and dies, leaving around $9 million for his son to get after he turns 18. By the end of the series, Walt has left behind money, yes, but that's money his family sees as dirty, and no amount of money matters to them after all the death and destruction he's caused. And that's the tragedy of Walter White. He lived and died for nothing. So now that you know the basic premise and characters of the show, let's start to dive deeper into the series with a character analysis of our anti-hero, Walter White. Breaking Bad is a beloved show with high ratings and plenty of Emmy nominations and awards under its belt, and this is in no small part because of the main character of the series, the anti-hero Walter White. A lot of people watch Breaking Bad and unironically stan him, which I get because the point of the show is to make him look cool, to turn a hero into a villain right before our eyes. But I never saw him that way. I hated him and wanted him to face his comeuppance for the entire series. He was such an asshole, and nothing he ever said to himself or to others to justify his actions ever worked on me. But you still see I'm the one who knocks and Heisenberg merch everywhere, and it kind of just makes me cringe a little bit. It makes me think of those people who unironically stan Dwight from The Office, who is alluded to being a descendant of Nazis multiple times in the series. Anyway, in the beginning of this video, I called Breaking Bad a show catered for and marketed to middle-aged and aging white men, and I stand by this. Not just because of the casting, like how many old, bald white men are in this show, but because Walt is living out what seems to be a lot of white men's fantasies. This idea that you can regain control of your life, shave your head, yell at your wife, be a hero to your son, etc. In season 1, Walter rapes and sexually assaults Skyler in this odd fit of I don't know what, but it's disturbing as hell, and I don't think that's discussed enough. This is framed as disturbing to the audience, but mainly because Walt is seen as gross for being sick, not because he's trying to abuse his wife. And this is of course the trick with writing anti-heroes like Walt, characters we love to hate but also kind of love. Did the writers do a good job at making Walt unlikable if this many people think he's at least a little admirable or sympathetic? Is it on us, the audience, to check ourselves, or does that fall on the writers? I really don't know, and it reminds me a lot of 500 Days of Summer, where we're supposed to see how Tom is misinterpreting things, but instead a lot of people just came out loving Tom and hating Summer. Is that on us as viewers, or did the writers not do a good job? I have no idea, but let me know what you think down below because I am really curious about this. It's important to note that after season 1, though Walt is still reprehensible, the violence he inflicts on others is mainly shown off-screen as compared with the first season. He still yells and kills people and gets in fights with Jesse, but when he murders people, for instance, it's usually with his car, and he's not as physically violent towards his wife again until the very last episode. Most of his warfare on the show is psychological, or him not doing something that could save someone's life, rather than actually wringing his hands around someone's neck. I sometimes wonder why they did this, and I think it was to make him more likable. Due to the popularity of his character in the show, which is basically just all about him, it also makes me wonder why. Why is this character resonating with so many people? Walter White has been described as the angry white man personified. The entitled white man who feels like he's been shortchanged by the system because why wouldn't he feel that way? He's been told that people who look like him deserve the best and are to be rewarded, so why hasn't he? As Emily Vander Werf wrote in their 2013 article, Breaking Bad's Racial Politics, Walter White, Angry White Man, Walt's justifications for why he should have what he wants stem almost entirely from believing that he's owed in some way, that the universe has screwed him over. Yet when the series begins, he has a pretty good life. He has a beautiful wife, a loving son, a baby on the way, and a house with a swimming pool. Maybe he doesn't like either of his jobs, but who does? And when he gets cancer, his old friends who feel indebted to him offer to pay for his treatments. Yet all Walt needs is the slightest provocation to look around himself, reach out for anything within reach, and cry out, "I want that," like a spoiled toddler. To me, Breaking Bad is fully aware of what Walt is playing into. Why else would they put him in his tighty-whities so often juxtaposed with a gun in his hand? But does it do a good job at conveying this message? That in reality, you shouldn't want to be like White because he's a first-class a-hole douchebag, because he doesn't care about anyone but himself, because his ends don't justify their means, because he lacks basic empathy or human decency. I'm honestly not sure. I want to put the blame on the audience for not figuring out that Walt is a bad guy because it is clear to me that the writers are trying to tackle this idea of white maleness. But still, part of it is on the writers who purposefully make him toe that line because that's the point. And yeah, sure, that's the point, but how good is that point when you have people who are so consumed by their love for Walter that they want to kill the actress who plays his wife because she's in the way? For this video, I've read a lot of old, like decade-old fan forums about this show to see where the culture was at the time, and a lot of people hate when you start to diagnose Walter because he's just a regular everyday dude who's just supposed to be any one of us. And that concerns me greatly. He's just doing what anyone would do in this situation. Like, really though, is he? Walter is a textbook narcissist, and he's been that way before he ever got started in the meth business. It turns out that he left Grey Matter, the company which he helped co-found, that is now worth $1 billion, because of his pride. He felt inferior to his partner's family and wealth, so he left. Years later, he would go on to refuse a job at the company, as well as payment for his cancer treatment. In addition to Walt's pride, he's extremely self-centered and self-absorbed, even poisoning a child in order to get Jesse back on his side. He even lets Jesse's girlfriend die when he could have saved her because she would be bad for business. He's constantly playing God with people's lives just because he can. Lastly, he has an excessive need for admiration that constantly gets him in trouble. One day, Hank is talking about what a genius this other meth chemist is, and Walt, needing to be the best and brightest at all times, almost gives himself away as the true genius behind the meth empire his DEA brother-in-law is investigating. Walt must always be the best, and whenever that's challenged, he acts impulsively, lies for personal gain, attempts to control people with threats of aggression, specifically his wife and surrogate son Jesse, and uses his intelligence and the little charm he does have to get what he wants, again, usually from his family members, but also whenever it suits him. Walt is a sociopathic character, and that's okay. That's why fictional characters are so cool, because they're fictional. That's also part of the point and intentional in the writing. Him being mentally unwell is part of his character, and we shouldn't act like that's not there, or that he's representing the everyman, because he's not. Walter is just Walter. He may have some things in common with the larger culture or viewership, but he's not a one-to-one corollary for your average Joe, and that's a good thing in my opinion. But I can see why people would be quick to jump to that defense because they see themselves in him, and don't want to be labeled as X, Y, or Z. And just to be clear, just because you like a character who's narcissistic or sociopathic doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. Rather, I think that because Walt is a middle-aged white man, he tends to represent the default human being in US society. So therefore, that's why it's so easy for people to identify with him, even when he's being evil. But in all, the main reason why I think Walt is such a compelling character isn't only the way he's written, but in the choices the writers give him. After all, what defines a fictional character more than the choices they make? One of my favorite sequences in the show is when Walt needs to drop off the meth for drug lord boss Gus in Season 2, Episode 12, and suddenly gets a text from Skyler saying that she's in labor and the baby's coming and he needs to decide what he's going to do. Drop off the meth or go to the hospital, and in the end, he misses his daughter's birth to drop off the meth. He makes a big deal about it being for the family, but in the end he had a choice and he didn't choose his family. Rather than trying to spend the most time he can with them as he is, he focuses so much on the business and leaving something for them that he tears his own family apart, and then they all end up hating him. After he misses the birth, he of course blames Jesse for it and lashes out at him because he can't take any responsibility for his own actions. Jesse is constantly used as Walt's pawn, scapegoat, and punching bag. As much as he says he loves Jesse and sees him as family, Walt's the reason at the end of season 5 that Jesse becomes enslaved. If you told me when I first started watching the series that Jesse would become enslaved to a white supremacist gang, I wouldn't have believed you, but that's where he ends up in the end of the series. Like Jesse said so much earlier, things were better when Walt wasn't in his life, and honestly, truer words have never been spoken. Also, before we end this, if you do end up watching the show, take a shot whenever Walt goes on an "I'm doing this for my family" speech, and then take another shot when he does the exact opposite. The writers of Breaking Bad are very aware of who their main demographic is, as seen with the casting of the show. Hint, they're all white, but at the same time I have to give them credit for at least trying to comment on how lame it is to be an angry, entitled white guy. I think that's why I like Mike so much, because he was always trying to humble Walt, tell him, "We have a good thing going, don't ruin it," but of course Walter ruins everything. So it makes sense that the writers, who though didn't name Walter White because he's, well, white, would realize that he's a white guy in New Mexico and try to comment on that a little bit. And in fact, racial politics in the show are pretty much always present, but there's still some gaffes along the way, so let's get into it. We can see that the writers want to talk about race in the first season of the series with the character of Hugo Archuleta, and they do a pretty good job at commenting on how racial profiling works on a police level and in everyday life. Hugo is the school janitor and is later fired for being accused of stealing lab equipment, which in fact Walter stole. Hugo is the perfect suspect for the DEA. He's non-white, had a blunt in his car, and I'm pretty sure already has a record. All the white parents are immediately up in arms about this, and you get some pretty ignorant lines from Marie and Skyler about how dare this person work at a school, how did he even get this job, and the camera focuses on their horrified expressions that the school janitor happened to be smoking a doobie. Skyler and Marie become the typical overly concerned white women. Hugo is one of Walt's first casualties. Walt obviously can't turn himself in, so he tries to create some reasonable doubt and sympathy for Hugo, but it's not his priority. Even though Hugo cleaned up Walt's vomit from the bathroom time and time again and showed true concern for him as Walter's cancer became harder to ignore, Walt doesn't return the favor. What's even more aggravating is that Skyler admits to having smoked pot in college, but then berates Hugo for doing the same thing. But she's not the only hypocrite. Marie constantly steals things because of her kleptomania, but because of her husband's connections with the police, is always let go. What a joke. And I think we're made to see the hypocrisy and irony in all of this, maybe not even as a racial thing, but just in general, but to me at least it's very clearly racialized. Skyler uses her white woman's tears to get out of tough situations, as well as threatens that she's going to go into labor, and it works every time. Again, not sure if this was intentional or noticed at the time as a race thing, but it is. However, even though the show makes these white people look like hypocrites and fools, Hugo never comes back. We never see what happens to him, and he barely gets any speaking lines. In addition, though Skyler and Marie's reactions to Hugo are expected, it doesn't make them any less annoying or grating to sit through. In the end, Hugo, like I said, is just a casualty in Walt's life, and this pattern of black and brown, namely Mexican American and Mexican characters having their lives ruined or ended in Walt's wake, becomes a very annoying pattern. The show does seem to be aware that the greater Latino and Native American population, and specifically the Nuevo Mexicano population, the Nuevo Mexicanos being an ethnic group residing in New Mexico and the Southwest, are treated differently than the white population. However, does this knowledge that the writers seem to have extend past just using them as villains and death fodder? Well, for the most part, sadly, no. This can be most obviously and tragically, like I just mentioned, seen in their deaths. As many have pointed out, brown blood tends to spill more often than white blood, and when white characters die, their deaths are seen as a moral turning point, as something we should all sit and contemplate solemnly. As Chris Prioleo wrote in their article, Walter White and Bleeding Brown on Breaking Bad's Race Problem in 2013, and while brown blood flows as free and unlamented as tap water, anytime a white character is killed, it signals a moral turning point in the show, a sign that things may have gone too far. Jane, Gail, Mike, Drew Sharp, these deaths are shown to have moral weight, whereas mostly every brown life that is taken is seen as inevitable. In contrast, the death of the black and brown characters are seen as fodder, sometimes even funny, and overall not something to think too hard over. The exception to this being Andrea, Jesse's girlfriend, but even she dies very unceremoniously and just to further Jesse's torment. Her character gets some fleshing out, but she's not a mainstay of the cast by any stretch of the imagination. Even Gus's death, Gus being the big bad for 2 seasons, is somewhat hokey. What Gus does before he dies makes sense, buttoning his coat, straightening his tie, and it was the actor Giancarlo Esposito's idea, and it makes you feel like almost like, oh my god, he's still alive. But then we get the reveal, and he falls flat on his face like some sort of comic book villain. You almost expect there to be a splat sound effect. As Prioleo wrote, he, Gus, fluctuated between cool, distant businessman and sadistic wild murderer like a character from a cheap spy novel. And Gus, like most of the Latin American characters on the show, are villains for Walter to outsmart, trick, and kill. And sure, Gus was going to kill Walt first, but it still exemplifies this very racialized pattern, especially since Gus was so smart and went undetected for years until White showed up and everything, like usual, went to shit. Gus does get a bit of a backstory. We don't know whether his brother was his friend, lover, or actual brother, which is annoying because I did want to see more of his backstory and get to know him more, but instead he doesn't really have a character other than being all-seeing and all-knowing until Walter can finally get him. By the 5th season, the bad guys are no longer Mexican and more broadly Latin American cartel members, as Gus was Chilean, but rather a white supremacist gang with swastikas on their necks. To me, this felt like the show was trying to even itself out. Like, we had 4 seasons of cartel members, and maybe that was kind of unfair, so now let's throw in some white villains just for good measure. Equal opportunity villainy. Yay. Honestly, I was happy to see neo-Nazis being the villains, but they came off as really hokey to me in the end, mainly because they were like lovable neo-Nazis. They were allowed to banter, they cared about their family, and they even gave Walt a barrel of money and didn't kill him when they had the chance. Sure, they enslaved Jesse and killed Andrea, but that was all done by Todd, who exemplifies no white supremacist beliefs at all. When he kills Andrea, he says it's nothing personal. None of the neo-Nazi gangs say anything offensive as far as I remember, they're just kind of there for the racial villain quota. Todd is the white supremacist we see the most of, and he's the one who we see work under Walter and do most of the killings and torturings. His uncle is the one who kills Hank, but none of this is racially motivated. It's just business. Todd also has this weird fixation with Lydia, another season 5 flop of a character who helps transport the meth overseas, as well as provide methylene, a key ingredient in the meth. We don't know whether Todd's crush is supposed to be creepy or cute, but he never does anything to her or her to him, and it all goes nowhere. Also, while we're on the subject of Todd, can I just say it's always uncles in this show? There's Tio and Tuco, and then there's this white supremacist gang where there's Todd and his uncle. What are with uncles on this show? Another point that other critics have brought up is that White is the exceptional white man, or the mighty whitey as some have dubbed him. Walter White comes into the meth business, a business that Gus and the cartel have been working at for years, and then is suddenly the best in the business because he uses chemistry, not like those bad subpar Mexican chemists who Jesse promptly schools, of course. As Malcolm Harris wrote in their review in 2013 entitled Walter White Supremacy, amazing title by the way, the scene in Breaking Bad's 4th season when Jesse Pinkman, a failure at high school chem, shows up in a room of Mexican scientists is full of supremacist glee. The Mexicans can wave their skill and experience around, but the science equipment knows objective quality, and there's no competing with the only white guy in the room. And within, let's say, a year later, Walt is almost running the entire operation himself, has killed all of the old school cartel members, and Gus, and it's like... In addition, some writers have pointed out an obsession with purity that runs through the show. For example, Walt's meth is the purest anyone has ever seen, and thus makes himself indispensable to Gus and the cartel when he's still working for them. His genius makes him valuable to them. But then you have to ask yourself, why? Because when we see who's buying Walt's product, it's people who are barely making ends meet. Of course, Walt doesn't want to know any of this because he knows once he finds out who his customers are, he probably wouldn't be doing what he's doing. Big probably on that front. But anyway, these people just want to get high and they don't care about numbers or the chemistry or the brand. To quote Harris, when we do see White's ultimate customers, they're zombies, all scabs and eroded teeth. We're not talking about impulse buyers or comparison shoppers here. It's a textbook case of what freshman economics students call inelastic demand. As Stringer Bell told D'Angelo Barksdale in another show about drugs, in direct contrast to what Walter claims, When it's good, they buy. When it's bad, they buy twice as much. The worse we do, the more money we make. And in the end, there's no competition because Gus and Walt own the entire market, so who are they even competing against? The customers don't have a choice but to buy from Walt and use his product, not because it's the best, but because that's all that's available. And another question, if it's so valuable and pure, who the hell can even afford this when all we see are people again barely making ends meet, barely surviving? Where is all of Gus and Walt's money coming from? In season 5, we're just supposed to believe that it's huge in the Czech Republic where Lydia's selling it, but we're just supposed to take that at face value? No. The longer the show goes on, the less and less we see of who's actually using the product, and it becomes less and less believable that purity matters and that the product has to be up to these standards. All of this is to say that Walt's mightiness doesn't come from the fact that he's some sort of chemistry genius, but that it comes from him just being a white guy who cooks meth. In the end, at least for me, the show doesn't give a reason why the purity of the meth should matter. It only matters to make Walt seem important, and as the show goes on, the less and less I buy it. They give him this ability to make him better than the black and brown people who have been doing this for years, but in reality, it's just because they can't say it's because he's white. Do I think that this is intentional? No, I really don't think any of the bias in this show is intentional, and I do believe that it's all implicit. However, that doesn't necessarily excuse its impact. I will say that I really did like Gomez's character, even though we never see any of his personal life, and he's like the token guy of color on the cast for all 5 seasons. I also thought his death was as unceremonious as Andrea's. While doing some research, I did find some positive praise for Breaking Bad. For example, the Narco Corrido song sung and performed by Los Cuates de Sinaloa during the opening of Season 2, Episode 7, Negro y Azul, or Black and Blue. As Neam Thornton wrote in their 2013 article, Mexicans as Violent Narcos in Breaking Bad, the Narco Corrido has a complicated history. They are songs often, but not always, paid for by a leader of a cartel, to condemn or laud a major figure in the drug trade or to send a message to someone. They can celebrate murders, big deals, or to talk someone up. The performers' lives can be endangered, not only by whether their song is appreciated by the sponsor or the subject of the lyrics, they can also be under threat from an opposing group. Some of these performers write songs independently, without direct affiliation. Irrespective, it is a genre integral to the cultural reception and understanding of the drug trade on both sides of the border. Negro y Azul at the opening of Breaking Bad is a good example of one of these. It aesthetically plays with the low budget and often corny nature of the videos and is performed by a hugely successful group. The series is directly using this popular form as an important illusion, thereby recognizing its significance and interpolating Heisenberg/Walt into the meta-narrative the narco corridos engage in as if he were real. When I first saw this opening, I had no idea what to make of it or what was going on, but now that I know more about it, it is really cool that the writers thought to put it in, though I doubt many people would look it up afterwards to do their own research. Honestly, probably most people didn't get it. I know I didn't get it, but for those in the know, it's a nice nod to a very long tradition on both sides of the border. In addition, Danny Trejo as Tortuga, who only appears in 2 episodes, is one of the most well-known Mexican-American actors in the entire series, and his presence in the show was applauded. Trejo plays a cartel member turned police informant who is brutally murdered by another cartel member. His death, unfortunately, is just used to fuel Hank's own character arc. After Tortuga dies, Hank starts exhibiting signs of PTSD, and his mental health takes a downturn. Now, before we wrap this up, I just want to draw attention to this question that's thrown around a lot in fan forums, and that is Hank racist? And I just find that question to be so funny, as if being racist is some sort of thing you can either be or not be. Everyone is racist either implicitly or explicitly, even me, because we're all at the mercy of white supremacy, and therefore no one gets out unscathed, no matter how much commenters like to say that Hank wasn't racist because he loved Gomez like a brother. Asking is X character or X person in your life racist isn't really asking anything. Yes, of course the white family, including Hank, are racist, but that's okay, and I think that's also the point at times. It's okay to acknowledge that people or characters are racist because racism, specifically systemic racism enforced by cops and organizations like the DEA, are racist, and erasing that or trying to act like that's not part of the show or someone's character or system because you don't want to face the truth as a viewer or a person because it's too hard is wrong, because rather than trying to acknowledge racism and educate yourself, you can just say, no, he wasn't racist, and move on and continue to take the path of least resistance. So if Breaking Bad is entertainment for middling white men, where does that leave the women on the show? Well, let's break them down one by one. Firstly, there's Skyler White, Walter's wife. In an anecdote Walter gives, he tells us the first time he saw Skyler as a hostess in a restaurant he would frequent for lunch while working at his old job at the lab, and she was always doing crossword puzzles. So he started doing crossword puzzles to get her attention to make small talk. The way Walt describes this is romantic, but I think it's also supposed to be kind of creepy. During the retelling, Skyler starts crying, and I think it's because she's so sad at how life has treated them since then. But I think it's also because maybe that memory isn't happy for her. Either way, I thought Walt going to her place of work to try to get her to notice him was weird. Whether that was self-awareness in the writing or came across in the scene, I don't know, but that's how it came across to me. They also have like a 10-year age gap in the show, and in real life they have a 13-year age gap. This is important to note because most of the women on the show are older by Hollywood standards, meaning most are in their 40s, God forbid, and because of their age, they tend to be the target for rude insults. This is the exact opposite of how the men are seen on the show, the oldest in the series being Mike, whose age is seen as a badge of honor rather than something to be ashamed about. In the show, Skyler starts out as a housewife, and Walt is supporting them with his job as a teacher who also works part-time at a car wash. They don't have a lot of money, but I always loved their house and thought it was really nice. But either way, they have money issues, which are only exacerbated after Walt's diagnosis. At first, Walter keeps Skyler in the dark about his cancer and then about his meth business, but eventually he has to come clean, and Skyler, like most people in real life would be, is livid. Not only because Walt has been lying to her for months, causing her to worry about his well-being when he's off doing God knows what for hours and days on end, coming home bruised and bloodied, going into a fugue state, etc., but because he's putting their entire family at risk. Walt, for most of the show, not only has his cancer looming over him, but anyone he wrongs. There's constantly the threat of him or his family being hurt, but he refuses to even acknowledge that possibility because he's Heisenberg, goddammit. And for the record, I just hate his fucking hat and sunglasses. Like, can you pick a more conspicuous disguise? Because he thinks he's more capable than he is, he tells Skyler not to worry about the kids or her own well-being because everything's fine, and why can't you just be grateful and see what I'm doing for you and the family? Why can't you just see how hard I'm working? Blah, blah, blah. And Skyler doesn't take his bullshit. She starts leaving the house without telling him where she's going, which drives him crazy, by the way. Yeah, now you know how it feels, Walt. She even tries to file for a divorce and calls the cops on Walt, but she can't bring herself to divorce him because ultimately she doesn't want Flynn, her teenage son, to find out. She'd rather be the bitchy mom than have him find out what's really going on, so that's who she becomes, at least to her own son. She becomes the no-fun parent, whereas Walt gets to buy his son a Mustang. And to the eyes of many viewers, Skyler was a nuisance at best and a at worst. Because of how the show was crafted, Walt is usually seen in a somewhat sympathetic light. I never saw him that way, but many people did because that's the point, but at what cost? Anna Gunn, the actress who portrayed Skyler, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times after the show ended in 2013 about how the hate directed towards her character was specifically gendered. How because she was a female character and a female actress in her 40s, who was at times seen as overweight, the hate she faced was different and worse than the hate the male characters got, and she couldn't be more right about that. As Gunn wrote, "I'm concerned that so many people react to Skyler with such venom. Could it be that they can't stand a woman who won't suffer silently or stand by her man, that they despise her because she won't back down or give up, or because she is, in fact, Walter's equal? But I finally realized that most people's hatred of Skyler has little to do with me and a lot to do with their own perception of women and wives." People hated Skyler for a few reasons. 1, because she refused to be won over by Walt and refused to be grateful and admire him. 2, because she was seen as a bad mother. And 3, because she was seen as a hypocrite, once she did start egging on Walt to continue his business. There was no winning people over no matter what her character did. Skyler was seen as a bad mom because she worked too much. She wasn't motherly enough. She got a job, God forbid. She didn't let Flynn get the car he wanted. She didn't stand by Walt or support him enough. She didn't leave him when she had the chance. Why couldn't she just leave? It's a question a lot of women in domestic abuse and violence cases hear, and it's a tired one at that. As if Skyler didn't think about leaving. But then what? How does she explain it to her son who idolizes his father? How will she make ends meet? How will she know she's safe from Walt and his business? In the end, Skyler admits to us that she's a coward. She doesn't know what to do, but that she's doing her best, and that's that. And maybe she's not a mastermind like Walt who's able to think 12 steps ahead, but she's not going to back down. As Gunn wrote in her op-ed, Vince Gilligan, the creator of Breaking Bad, wanted Skyler to be a woman with a backbone of steel, who would stand up to whatever came her way, who wouldn't just collapse in the corner or wring her hands in despair. He and the show's writers made Skyler multi-layered and, in her own way, morally compromised, but at the end of the day, she hasn't been judged by the same standards as Walter. Skyler also cheated on Walt, which Walt of course is furious about, because we're a family, goddammit. And it's like, keep telling yourself that, old man. In the end, I think the way Skyler was written was really well done, and her character makes complete and total sense, and I do blame the audience for not understanding her better, but I think in hindsight we do. After Anna Gunn published her piece in the Times, a Slate article with a pretty petty headline came out called, "Hey Anna Gunn, not everyone hates Skyler White," as if that was going to make her feel better. The article basically summarizes that just because those people are the loudest in fan forums, that doesn't actually necessarily represent the entire fan base. And it's like, yeah, you don't think she knows that? Gunn's feelings are completely valid. I think it's really shitty to be like, well, not all fans feel that way. Like, okay, good for them, good for you. In addition, Skyler was seen as a hypocrite to fans for not only being so morally uptight about Walt, but still staying with him, but also because later, when she did take Walt's side, she told him to kill Jesse. What's one more? So which is it then? Why is her turn so much worse than Walt's? Is it because women, specifically mothers, need to be the moral compass for the men in their life? Anna Gunn was also the target of a specific type of sexism in which women are called men as an insult. It happened to Lady Gaga and a slew of other celebrities, and it happened to her. Because Anna Gunn didn't present as feminine enough to the male viewers, they called her a man, said she was ugly, and berated her appearance because that's a nice thing to do to someone. Marie is the second most prominent female character in the cast, and she plays Hank's wife. Hank, by the way, I know he's an ass, but he was my favorite character because he was just as smart as Walt and almost took him down, but unfortunately he turned out to be pretty lame in the end. Like, why didn't you just record your phone call with Walt confessing everything and then go to the DEA office and then send your guys to get him rather than risk your own life? I guess it's part of his hubris, but God, that was lame. Anyway, for most of the show with Marie, I was Skyler during her mental breakdown of telling her to just shut up. Marie is so annoying, but only because she doesn't know what's going on. So of course it makes sense that she's annoying and nosy and in the way of Hank and Skyler and Walt's business, because she doesn't know what's going on and we all do. I don't think Marie faced as much hate from the fandom as Skyler, but I just hated Marie for the character that she was written as, the overly bossy and nosy sister who never knows when to shut the hell up. She crosses so many boundaries, particularly with Skyler. The most heinous is trying to steal Holly, Skyler's daughter, after Marie finally discovers the truth about Walt. I found her subplot about kleptomania to be really lame and it never really goes anywhere. She's just overall a good wife who loves her husband, but other than that is just very boring and only there to be a pain in the ass and kind of an antagonist to Skyler. Next, there's Jane, Jesse's first girlfriend we see in the series, who then dies after an overdose while Walt watches, doing nothing to try to save her from choking on her own vomit. I really like Jane, and even though I know a lot of people didn't like her because she made Jesse use again, but honestly he was going to use with or without her. However, she did introduce him to heroin, which he never did before, so there's that. They both enabled each other in the long run, and I liked her character and Jesse's because they show how hard it is to get clean and to stay clean. It's something that you know is wrong, but you rationalize it in your head, and it's a really chronic disease that you have to fight for your entire life, and it's not easy, and it's sad. When Walter does give Jesse and Jane the money that Jesse is owed, they're not in their right mind, and honestly, who would be after receiving all of that cash? It goes to your head, and I originally thought that Jane was going to drug Jesse and leave, but instead Jane dies, and that's the catalyst for the flight crash and the events of Season 3. In the end, I didn't like what the writers did to Jane because I didn't think she needed to die, and she could have just left or run away. I thought it was really gratuitous and hopeless, which I get is the point, but it's just really bleak. Anyway, Andrea, who also has a kid brother who's selling meth and murdering the competition, is later killed by Gustavo, and then Jesse seeks revenge, but Walter beats him to it, killing the guys who killed Andrea's brother, and Jesse runs away. Andrea and Jesse later reconnect, and Andrea's son Brock is poisoned by Walt, and then Walt lies to Jesse and makes him think Gus did it, and by doing so Jesse goes back to being on Walt's side and agrees to help kill Gus. Either way, Andrea's whole family is broken up by Walter White, and it just really freaking sucks. Like, none of these women get happy endings. To be fair, out of the men on the show, only Jesse gets a somewhat happy ending in that he's just not enslaved anymore or owes anyone anything, but still, he's scarred for life. I think it's also important to mention that for the most part, the female characters are defined by their relationship to the male main characters. We don't see Andrea on her own terms. We see her as a sister, girlfriend, and mom. Skyler is a wife, and Marie is a wife, and Jane is a girlfriend and daughter. Walter gets to be a cook. He gets to be Heisenberg. Jesse gets to be Jesse and exist apart from whatever romantic subplot he has going on. Hank is a DEA agent. Yeah, Marie is a radiologist, but when do we ever see her outside of the family unit? We see her shoplifting a few times in the first season, but then that gets dropped later. The only other time we see her outside of the context of her husband is when she's in therapy talking about poison she's looking up to kill Walt. Skyler's an accountant, but her jobs are all dependent on the men in her life, Ted and later Walt at the car wash. And this I do fault on the writing. Sure, the female characters are well written, their motivations well planned out, and their actions match up with the situations they're in and who they are as people. But what the writers fail to do is make the women's lives as interesting as the men's lives. They don't make the domestics seem as important as the outside world of men. Sure, the men's lives are considered higher stakes because that's where the killing goes on, where the money changes hands, and where we're trained as audience members to care more about. Men's stories of war, money, and life and death situations have always been seen as more important than the domestic lives of women. What's more fun to watch? Skyler trying to keep her family together and be a working mom, or Walt and Jesse trying to find new and inventive ways to kill a fly at their lab? And I want to challenge this idea that life and death stories are just naturally more interesting than the inner workings and little dramas of women, because they're not. They've just been marketed that way. Skyler and Marie's stories could have been more interesting not just as homemakers, but as working women or as women just being people making choices apart from their husbands, but they almost never get to do that. I don't think this is because the writing is incompetent or because the writers hate women, but rather because we're all trained to see Walt, Jesse, Mike, and Saul's story as the real story, and the women's tales as derailing from the plot, as detours, rather than actually important. One major theme I want to explore in this video is that of disability. One of the main cast members, RJ Mitty, has cerebral palsy, and in Breaking Bad his character Flynn uses mobility devices, in this case crutches, to move around. The casting call requested an actor with cerebral palsy, and Mitty knew that this role was made for him. According to Mitty, Flynn's character was inspired by someone Gilligan knew in college. In the series, Mitty's disability is part of his character, but it's not his entire character. He's able to just be Walt's son and to just be a person. He jokes around with his uncle, fights with his mom, and helps his Aunt Marie. After his role in Breaking Bad, Mitty started his own campaign to stop bullying called Cut the Bull. And in a Season 1 episode, Flynn does face bullying for who he is, and Walt rightfully attacks the bullies. Walt and Skyler never resent Flynn. They never even bring up his disability. He's their son, and that's that. I think it would be easy for the writers to be ableist and make Walt out as even more of a loser in that his son is disabled, but not once does that ever come up. I don't know if that ableism is supposed to be implied by just us as viewers, but I really hope not. Though I'm sure some see Flynn being disabled as another nail in the coffin for Walt, but it's never explicitly or even implicitly shown in the show that the parents resent their son for who he is or see his disability as being that nail in the coffin. Hank also becomes disabled later in the series after being shot and then paralyzed from the waist down. He does get feeling back in his legs and is able to walk again with the help of others and mobility devices. By the end of the series, he does still have a limp, but he's getting around and that's that. I really do like how they handle Hank's recovery, and like always, they don't sugarcoat anything. We see Marie taking care of him, we see him in physical therapy, and the nice thing is that Marie never resents caring for Hank. And Hank doesn't need to be a perfect victim or patient. He's angry, he's frustrated, he lashes out, he's really going through it not only because he has the task of learning how to walk again, but also because of his PTSD due to his job. Though he lashes out at Marie a lot, she never scolds him, and I actually really like that. Marie is really understanding when she wants to be, and that's nice to see. Hank also apologizes for how he acted later on, and good for him. I like how we get to see his and Marie's ups and downs and how much they truly love and care for one another. It's just nice. Not resenting or being hostile towards disabled people is really the bare minimum, so it's nice that the show just doesn't do that, but also continues to grow Hank and Flynn's characters. Lastly, Walter is disabled due to his cancer, but like Hank and Flynn, it's part of his character but not his entire character. I think they mainly use Walter's cancer as like a ticking time bomb device to add tension, though they comment on the healthcare system through his cancer, which we'll get to in the next section. Walt doesn't let cancer stop him from doing what he wants, even if it means he passes out multiple times. And it's not really a story about overcoming or beating the disease. It's mainly just about learning how to live with it and again, not letting it define him, just like how Flynn and Hank aren't defined by their disabilities, but that also doesn't mean that it's not a part of them. One thing that is different, however, is that Walt's cancer diagnosis and subsequent chronic recovery and remission is annoying to him because people start to pity him or see him as a charity case, even his own son. And he's determined not to be seen like that, even though all these people just want to help him and aren't necessarily pitying him, but just want to help. It's definitely a fine line that you need to walk on, and sometimes Walt sees his family as going too far, like when Flynn sets up an online fundraiser for his dad. Even though it's done with good intentions, it's not what Walt wants. There's one scene in the series where they do host an intervention for Walt, where Walt says he doesn't want to do anything about the cancer and just wants to live as long as he can with it. But anyway, I honestly did side with Walt. This is his life and his choice, but of course I also understood it from his family's point of view. It's a really hard topic to talk about with no clear answer, but I think the show did a good job at dealing with it, at least from what I've read and seen. But let me know what you think about Breaking Bad's portrayal of disability in the comments down below. The last thing I want to talk about is class commentary as shown in Breaking Bad. Firstly, there's the class commentary when it comes to healthcare. The whites can't afford Walter's medical bills, which add up to almost $200,000. Basically, if you can't afford to have cancer, you die. Not only that, but Walter is a teacher, a job that is tragically underfunded and undervalued. There's an argument that teachers shouldn't demand better wages and healthcare because it's a job that's supposed to be selfless. And it's like, no, though. Being a teacher is freaking hard as hell, and it's not compensated properly in the slightest. Walt being a high school teacher is done not only to make him be seen as a loser in society because he's wasting his talents, but also because teachers don't make enough money to live, and most teachers work second jobs, just like Walt, and that fucking sucks. Because of Walt's lack of financial resources, Walt's wealthy colleagues from Gray Matter Technologies, Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, offer to pay his bills, and I think offer him a job at the company. Walt is furious at this because he was the one who helped start Gray Matter in the first place, but he sold his share for $5,000 after his pride was bruised due to Gretchen's wealth. Walt's inferiority complex stopped him from heading into a lucrative business deal, but like always, he'll blame everyone but himself. Walt finds another way to pay for the treatments, but the show does contain social commentary on how bad medical care is in the US if you don't have the money to survive, and they say very bluntly, that's not right. I also applaud the show for not touting Walt as a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy, because he's the worst and someone you should never want to emulate, though I'm sure some people see him as like the ultimate entrepreneur. I think the fact that he loses almost all of his money in the end really helps dissuade people from seeing him like that, but I'm still not sure. I still wish he had lost everything. When we see Gretchen and her husband living the high life, the life Walt thinks he should have had, and then scaring the living bejesus out of them in season 5, I think we're supposed to be happy about that. Like these rich bastards are finally getting what's coming to them. And honestly, I'm glad he stuck it to them. They really do turn more villainous as the show goes on, even saying that Walt had no hand in creating the company, though I do wonder how much of that is true considering Walt is an unreliable point of view character. He could just be lying with how much he contributed and could be wrong, but I'm just theorizing here. Either way, the Schwartzes are supposed to not be good because they're rich and Walt isn't. But if Walt was rich, would we hate them as much? I don't think so. The healthcare system is indicted yet again when Hank's insurance won't cover the cost of his recovery after he's temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Skyler and Walt take over and help Marie pay for Hank's recovery because they're family, but also because they're the reason why, or Walt's the reason why, Hank is in this situation to begin with. If Walt had never started working with Gus, the twins would have just killed Walt, but Gus traded Walt's life for Hank, even though Gus did call Hank to warn him. Later, Walt gets Hank into a car accident after he almost discovers his meth lab, willingly putting his family, who he says he cares so much about, in danger. Take a shot. After Hank finds out about Walt and the meth, he's so close to turning Walt in, but then realizes he can't because Marie took Walt's money to pay for his recovery. I really like how the commentary about the healthcare system is ongoing, at least for the first 3 to 4 seasons, because medical bills aren't cheap and are some of the most relatable forms of debt to the US public at large. Overall, Breaking Bad is a good show. Though it has its flaws, of which there are many, there's also a lot of real-life commentary in there about life, gender, race, class, and disability. I also applaud the series for not trying to pull out any twists to outsmart the audience and instead had a very clear ending that was very satisfying. I think we all knew Hank had to die in the end, unfortunately. I haven't seen the Jesse movie El Camino, but I'll have to check it out soon. I am watching Better Call Saul now, currently on season 2, but I don't like it very much and find it extremely boring. In fact, I think I might stop watching it. Mike was another one of my favorite characters though, so I like that he's in this Breaking Bad prequel, and Better Call Saul is still going on. I think the 6th season is supposed to come out this year. Anyway, I just wanted to make a video about Breaking Bad because I had so many thoughts about it, and I am really curious to hear your thoughts too, so let me know what you thought of this video and Breaking Bad the series down below. And I just wanted to say that I did all of the artwork for this video and it was really satisfying to do. I've been trying to incorporate my artwork more and more into my videos, so I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.